The market bell had only just struck 10 when the horse broke free. It came from the direction of the smithy, a great bay gelding still harnessed to a broken shaft. Its eyes rolled white with terror, its hooves striking sparks from the cobbles as it thundered into the crowded square. Stalls scattered. A basket of eggs went under its hooves in a single wet crack. Somewhere a woman screamed, and the sound seemed to travel through the crowd like a spark through dry hay, so that within seconds the whole market had become a churning, panicked thing, bodies pressing backward, carts overturning, and at the center of it all, frozen in the open lane where the horse was bound to pass, stood a small boy in a green wool coat. He could not have been more than 7. He had been chasing a hoop only a moment before, laughing, his nurse too stalls back haggling over ribbon, and now he stood alone in the horse's path, with his hoop forgotten at his feet, and his mouth open on a sound that would not come. Eleanor Winslow saw him the instant she looked up from her basket of thread. She did not think. There was no moment of decision that she could have named afterward, no weighing of her own safety against his. Her body simply moved, faster than her mind could follow, cutting sideways through the fleeing crowd instead of with it, her skirts catching and tearing on a cartwheel she did not feel. She reached the boy 3 strides before the horse did. She did not try to pull him clear in the ordinary way, for there was no time and no space left for ordinary ways. She caught him beneath the arms and threw them both sideways into the lee of a stone trough, and the horse passed so close behind her that she felt its heat and the wind of its passing lift the hair from her neck, and then it was gone, screaming past the trough and on through the ruin of the fish stalls toward the lane beyond. For a moment neither of them moved. The boy's face was pressed into her shoulder, his small hands fisted in the wool of her cloak, and she could feel his heart going like a bird's against her own chest. She held him and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say, only the fact of his living weight in her arms and her own breath coming ragged and disbelieving. Around them the square was beginning to gather itself back into shape, the way water closes over a stone. Voices rose. Was anyone hurt? Had anyone seen where the beast had come from? Whose horse was it? God in heaven, did you see her? Did you see what she did? And Eleanor became aware, dimly, that people were looking at her, that a circle had opened around the trough where she knelt with the boy still gathered against her, and that she did not yet know whose child she held. She would learn soon enough. But in that first moment, she knew only that he was safe, and that seemed, for the space of several long breaths, to be the only fact in the world worth holding. It was his nurse who reached them first, white to the lips, snatching him up with a cry that was half sob, and it was the nurse's next words, gasped to no one in particular as she pressed her face into the boy's hair, that told Eleanor precisely what she had done. Thank God. Thank God. If anything had happened to Master Henry, the Duke would never. The words trailed off into weeping. But Eleanor had heard enough. The boy she had caught from beneath the hooves of a runaway horse was the son of the Duke of Alderbourne. She had lived within 3 miles of Alderbourne Hall her whole life, and had never once seen its master up close. She knew him only as a name spoken with a certain weight in the town. A young widower, it was said, who had shut half the house since his wife's death 2 winters past, and kept to himself and to the boy, and who was rumoured to be neither cruel nor warm but simply absent, a grief-worn figure glimpsed occasionally at the edge of the church green or through the window of his carriage. She had never expected to hold his son in her arms in the middle of a ruined market, and she found, kneeling there with her skirts torn and her hands still trembling, that she did not know what to do with the knowledge, except set it gently aside and help the shaken little boy to his feet. "It's over now," she told him, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You're quite safe. There now." He looked up at her with wide, wet eyes and something in his face, not fear any more, but a kind of astonished gratitude too large for a child to hold neatly, made her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. "You caught me," he said, as though it were the most remarkable fact in creation. "I did," she agreed, "and you're very brave for not crying." He was, in fact, about to cry, and did, but she did not think less of him for it. She only gathered him closer for a moment and let him. It was in that posture, Eleanor kneeling in the wreckage of the market, the Duke's son held against her shoulder, her cloak torn and her palms scraped raw from the cobbles, that the Duke of Alderbourne found them. He had been 3 streets away when the horse bolted, dismounting from his own mare outside the draper's, and he had heard the screaming and known, with the particular cold certainty of a man who has already lost one person he loved and cannot survive losing another, that something had happened to his son. He had run the whole distance, coat flying open, hat lost somewhere behind him, and had arrived not in time to see the horse pass, not in time to see the girl move, but only in time to see the aftermath. His son alive, his son weeping but whole, held in the arms of a young woman he had never seen before, in a square full of overturned stalls and frightened townsfolk, all talking at once. He crossed the remaining distance in a few long strides and dropped to his knees before them, and for a moment he could not speak at all. He simply took his son from her arms, gently, but with a kind of desperate thoroughness, running his hands over the boy's shoulders and arms and face, as though he did not quite believe the evidence of his own eyes, and held him. "Papa," said Henry, muffled against his father's coat, "she caught me. The lady caught me before the horse." The Duke lifted his eyes to Eleanor then, and she felt the full weight of his attention land on her like something physical. He was younger than she had imagined, and there was a rawness in his face just then, a nakedness of feeling that a man of his rank was surely not meant to show in a public square, and for a moment she saw not a duke at all, but only a father who had very nearly lost his child. "You saved him," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I only did what anyone would have done, Your Grace," she said, and rose unsteadily to her feet, brushing uselessly at the ruin of her skirts. But that was not true, and some part of her knew it even as she said it, for she had seen with her own eyes that no one else had moved. A dozen grown men and women had stood frozen in that square, while a horse bore down on a child, and only she had run toward the danger instead of away from it. She did not say this. It seemed unbecoming to claim it for herself, and besides, the shock of the last several minutes was only now beginning to catch up with her, so that her hands would not quite stop shaking. The Duke seemed to understand this without her needing to explain it. He studied her for a long moment, her torn cloak, her scraped palms, the dust of the square ground into the hem of her gown, and something shifted in his expression. A kind of attention that was not merely gratitude, but something closer to recognition, as though he were looking at a person rather than simply a stranger who happened to be useful. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor Winslow, Your Grace. I keep my mother's stall there with the thread and ribbon. What's left of it." He looked past her to where her stall lay collapsed in the general wreckage, its bolts of cloth trampled into the mud, and something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of an apology, though he did not voice it then. Instead he rose, still holding his son, and inclined his head to her with a gravity that made several onlookers murmur. "I am in your debt, Miss Winslow," he said, "more deeply than I know how to say in a marketplace. You will allow me to make what amends I can for your stall and—" He paused, glancing down at his son, who had one small fist still curled into his father's collar, as though unwilling to let go of anything solid. "And you will allow me to thank you properly, when there is less commotion in which to do it." "There is no need, Your Grace," she began, but he was already turning away, calling for someone to see to the injured, for the nurse to bring the carriage round, for a physician to be sent for though the boy seemed unhurt, moving through the wreckage with the brisk competence of a man glad to have something practical to do with his hands. Eleanor was left standing amid the ruin of the market, with her heart still hammering, and a strange, unplaceable feeling settling over her, not pride exactly, and not quite fear, but something adjacent to both, a sense that the ordinary shape of her life had shifted very slightly and would not settle back into its old lines. She did not yet know how right she was, nor how much of what followed would test her. The townsfolk in the hours after could speak of nothing else. By evening the story had grown several new limbs, as such stories do. In one telling she had thrown herself bodily beneath the horse's hooves. In another she had somehow calmed the beast with a word. In a third she had known all along whose son the boy was, and had acted for reward. Eleanor heard none of these tellings directly, being occupied with salvaging what could be salvaged of her mother's stall, and nursing the deep bruise blooming along her hip where she had struck the trough. But she felt their effects the following day in the way people looked at her in the lane, some with open admiration, a few with something more complicated. Chief among the latter was Beatrice Cole, whose family kept the largest linen draper's shop on the square, and whose own stall, situated not 10 feet from Eleanor's, had suffered scarcely any damage at all in the chaos, a fact Beatrice seemed to find obscurely galling, as though Eleanor's misfortune ought by rights to have been shared more evenly. "You might have been killed," Beatrice said to her the next morning, in a tone that suggested she had not quite decided whether this would have been a tragedy or simply a very great inconvenience to everyone concerned. "Running at a bolting horse. I should never have done anything so reckless." No, Eleanor agreed, without rancor, for she had never expected recklessness from Beatrice, and did not think less of her for it. "I don't suppose you would have." It was meant, and taken as something less than a compliment, though Eleanor had not intended unkindness by it. She had only spoken the plain truth as she saw it. Beatrice's mouth thinned, and she said nothing further, but Eleanor would remember, later, that this was the moment the seed of something had been planted, though she could not have said then what shape it would grow into. She did not have long to wait to find out. 3 days after the market, a note arrived at the small house Eleanor shared with her widowed mother, sealed with the Alderbourne crest, and written in a firm, unhurried hand. It requested, though the request carried the particular courtesy of a command, that Miss Winslow present herself at Alderbourne Hall on the following afternoon, that His Grace the Duke might discharge the debt of gratitude he owed her, and that Master Henry, who had spoken of little else in 3 days, might have the opportunity to thank his rescuer properly. Eleanor's mother, upon hearing the note read aloud, pressed both hands to her mouth, and then to her heart in quick succession. Torn between pride and a mother's ordinary anxiety at the thought of her daughter walking alone into a great house full of strangers and rank. "You'll wear the blue," she said finally, which was as close as she came to giving her blessing. "And mind you don't speak until you're spoken to, unless the boy asks you something, in which case you may say whatever you like, for he's earned that much of you at least." Eleanor laughed despite herself, and kissed her mother's cheek, and told her not to fret. But she felt, walking the 3 miles to Alderbourne Hall the following afternoon, with the hem of her blue dress carefully lifted clear of the road dust, a flutter of nerves she did not entirely understand, and which she told herself firmly was only the natural unease of a market stall girl about to walk beneath the roof of a duke. The hall, when it came into view, was larger and colder in its beauty than she had imagined, a long grey face of stone with tall windows catching the afternoon light, set among clipped hedges, and an avenue of elms just beginning to turn gold at their edges. She was received not at the great front doors, which she had half expected to be turned away from as unsuited to her station, but by a side entrance where a kindly, round-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Fairholt met her with evident warmth and no small amount of curiosity, and led her through a series of handsome, quiet corridors to a small sitting-room where the Duke waited with his son. Henry saw her first and abandoned all decorum, crossing the room at a run to seize both her hands. "You came," he said, as though there had been real doubt of it. "I told Papa you would come." I told him ladies who catch you from horses always keep their promises. I don't believe I promised anything, Eleanor said, smiling despite herself. But I'm glad to see you well, all the same. No bruises left? Only one, he said, with the particular pride small boys take in minor injuries, and displayed his elbow for her inspection with great solemnity. The Duke had risen when she entered, and now came forward, and Eleanor saw that he looked less raw than he had in the square 3 days prior, though there remained about him a certain contained gravity, as though he held himself carefully, the way a man holds a vessel he has once seen broken, and does not wish to see broken again. "Miss Winslow," he said, "thank you for coming. I hope the walk was not too taxing." "Not at all, Your Grace." He gestured her to a chair, and tea was brought, and for a quarter of an hour the conversation moved along the safe, shallow channels such occasions require, her mother's health, the damage to the stall, which he informed her had already been quietly and generously repaired at his order, a fact she tried to protest, and was gently but firmly overruled on. But beneath the surface courtesies, Eleanor became aware of him watching her in the unguarded moments, with an attention that was not merely the natural interest of a man toward the woman who had saved his son, but something quieter and more searching, as though he were trying to understand a particular kind of courage he had not expected to find in a market-stall girl in a torn cloak. "You did not hesitate," he said at one point, when Henry had wandered off to show Mrs. Fairholt a beetle he had found on the windowsill. "I've turned the moment over 100 times since. A dozen people stood in that square, grown men, and not one of them moved before you did. I didn't think of it as courage, Your Grace," Eleanor said honestly. "I only saw a child in danger. There wasn't time to think of anything else. That," he said after a moment, "is very nearly the definition of courage, Miss Winslow. The ones who stop to think are the ones who freeze." She did not know quite what to say to that, and so said nothing, and he seemed to understand her silence and did not press it, and the visit continued in easier, warmer channels from that point, until at last it was time for her to walk home before the light failed, and Henry begged so earnestly for her to come again that the Duke, with a faint, rueful smile that transformed his face entirely, said that Miss Winslow would surely visit again if her own duties allowed it, and that in the meantime his son must be content with looking forward to it. In the days immediately following that first visit to the hall, Eleanor found herself turning the whole strange episode over in her mind at odd hours, while kneading bread, while measuring ribbon for a customer, while lying awake listening to her mother's steady breathing in the next room. She had lived her whole life within a narrow, familiar compass: the stall, the cottage, the lane to church on Sundays, the occasional fair when the season allowed it. She had never imagined herself walking the long avenue of elms toward a duke's front doors, still less imagined that she would be made welcome there, and welcomed again, by a small boy who seemed to have decided, with the wholehearted conviction children bring to such decisions, that she belonged to him now in some essential way that required no further discussion. She was careful, in those early weeks, not to read too much into the Duke's own attentions. He was, she told herself firmly, a man discharging a debt of gratitude, nothing more. And if he lingered sometimes in the doorway of the nursery a little longer than strict necessity required, or if his questions to her drifted, now and again, into territory that had nothing to do with his son at all, what she thought of a particular book he had lately finished, whether she had ever wished to see the sea, how she had come to be so quick and steady in a crisis where others merely stood and stared, she told herself these were simply the ordinary courtesies of a man unused to easy company, and nothing more significant than that. It became, over the following weeks, a settled thing, though never formally arranged as such. Eleanor would call at the hall perhaps twice in a fortnight, ostensibly at Henry's invitation, to walk with him in the orchard or hear him practice his letters, or simply sit with him in the nursery while he told her, at great and repetitive length, the story of the horse and the trough, embellishing it a little more with each telling, until in his version she had very nearly flown. The Duke was often present for some part of these visits, drawn, she suspected, as much by his own inclination as by any strict necessity of supervision, and their conversations, begun always in the safe territory of Henry's doings, drifted more and more often into other country. Books he had read, and she had not had the leisure to. The state of the harvest. The quiet grief he carried for his late wife, which he spoke of only once, briefly, and which she received without trying to press further than he offered. She began, without quite admitting it to herself, to look forward to these visits with an eagerness that went beyond simple fondness for the boy. There was an afternoon in late summer when a sudden squall caught them in the orchard, and the Duke, rather than standing on ceremony, simply took her hand and Henry's both, and ran with them for the shelter of the old gardener's lodge, all three of them soaked through and laughing by the time they reached it. And Eleanor found herself thinking, with a small private shock, that she had never before seen him laugh so freely, nor felt herself so entirely at ease in the presence of a man of his rank. He built a fire in the lodge's small grate while they waited out the rain, and told Henry a story of his own boyhood, of a governess he had tormented, and a pond he had once fallen into in his best coat, and Eleanor watched him across the firelight and understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that whatever she felt for him now reached well beyond simple gratitude for his kindness to her family. There was another afternoon when Henry, practicing his letters at the nursery table, grew frustrated past bearing, and flung his slate to the floor in a fit of temper, and it was Eleanor, not his tutor nor his father, who knelt beside him and coaxed him gently back to the table, showing him a small trick with the shapes of the letters that made the lesson feel less like punishment and more like a game. The Duke, watching from the doorway unnoticed, said nothing at the time, but Eleanor learned later, from Mrs. Fairholt, that he had spoken of the incident more than once in the days following, remarking that he did not know where the boy would be, in temperament, without her steadying influence upon him. And there were the quieter afternoons besides, when Henry had been put down for his rest, and the Duke and Eleanor found themselves alone in the small sitting room, with nothing more pressing to occupy them than a pot of tea gone lukewarm, and a conversation that wandered wherever it pleased. He asked her once, half in earnest, half teasing, whether she had ever regretted running toward the horse instead of away from it, given all the trouble it had brought into her ordinary life, and she had answered, without needing to think about it, that she could not imagine having done otherwise, not for any trouble in the world. And he had looked at her then with an expression she did not yet have a name for, though she would come, in time, to recognize it well. The town, naturally, took notice. At first the talk was admiring. The girl who'd saved the little lord. Wasn't it a fine thing? Wasn't she a credit to her mother? But admiration among small communities has a way of curdling when it goes on too long unchallenged. And by the 6th week there were other undertones threading through the gossip. Some wondered aloud what a market-stall girl thought she was doing, calling so often at a duke's house. Others, more pointedly, wondered what she hoped to gain by it. Beatrice Cole, in particular, had not softened in her regard. If anything, the frequency of Eleanor's visits to Alderbourne Hall seemed to sharpen whatever resentment had first taken root in the wreckage of the market, and she was not shy about giving it voice, in the careful, deniable way of a woman who wishes to wound without appearing to have thrown the blow. "I only hope," she said one morning, in the hearing of several other stall-holders, "that Miss Winslow knows what people are beginning to say, that she caught the boy on purpose, that she'd marked him out beforehand, knowing whose son he was, and put herself in his path for the sake of what might come of it." Eleanor, arranging her ribbons 2 stalls away, heard this clearly, and felt the blood rise hot in her face. But she did not turn, did not dignify it with a response, telling herself that such talk, unanswered, would wear itself out for want of fuel. She did not yet understand how much fuel a determined tongue could manufacture, nor how far a rumor could travel once it had been given a plausible shape and set loose among people already primed to distrust a rise in fortune they had not earned themselves. It was perhaps 3 weeks after this that the second horse bolted. It was not the same beast. That gelding had long since been sold off by its chastened owner, a carter who had been careless with a loose harness pin, but a different animal entirely, a spirited young mare startled by a peal of church bells rung early for a wedding, who reared in her traces outside the chandler's shop and very nearly overturned the cart she was harnessed to, before a groom caught her head and settled her. No one was hurt. It was, in the ordinary run of market town life, a minor and quickly forgotten incident, except that Eleanor had been standing nearby when it happened, having gone to the chandler's for candles, and in the general startlement, several people had seen her flinch back from the plunging mare, with a sharp, involuntary cry, the entirely natural reaction of anyone startled by a rearing horse, only weeks after nearly being trampled by one. And Beatrice Cole, who happened also to be present, found in this small human moment of fright the raw material for something considerably uglier. By the following market day, the stories circulating through the square had transformed Eleanor's flinch into something else entirely, that she had somehow provoked the mare, that there was an unnatural connection between Eleanor Winslow and bolting horses that decent people ought to look at closely, that it seemed altogether too convenient that danger seemed to find children in her vicinity, and, the cruelest turn of all, delivered always with a show of great reluctance, as though the speaker hated to say it, that some were beginning to wonder whether the first rescue had been quite so spontaneous as it appeared, whether a girl so evidently ambitious for advancement might not have arranged, however she had managed it, for the Duke's own son to need saving. It was a monstrous, illogical claim, and Eleanor, when word of it finally reached her through her mother's white-faced reporting, could hardly credit that anyone would give it credence. But she underestimated, as the young and the innocent often do, the appetite certain minds have for a story that lets them resent what they cannot otherwise explain. The rumor reached Alderbourne Hall within the week, carried there, though Eleanor would not learn this until much later, by Mrs. Agatha Vell, a distant cousin of the Duke's late wife, who had taken up residence at the Hall some months prior, in the capacity of companion and general household authority, and who had watched the growing warmth between the Duke and the market girl with an anxiety that was, in its way, entirely sincere, though not entirely disinterested. Mrs. Vell had buried a husband and a fortune both, and had come to Alderbourne with the quiet, unspoken hope that her presence there might in time become permanent in a fashion rather grander than mere companion, and she had watched Eleanor Winslow's rising place in the household with something considerably less than goodwill. When the rumor of the second horse reached her ears, she did not pause to weigh its plausibility. She carried it straight to the Duke, dressed in the careful language of reluctant concern, a woman who hated to trouble him with such things, but felt it her duty, given his position, given the boy's safety, given how very little was truly known of this Winslow girl's character, beyond a single dramatic afternoon, that anyone, upon reflection, might have staged. The Duke, to his credit, did not believe it outright, but he was not, in that season of his life, a man entirely free of fear where his son's safety was concerned. He had buried a wife 2 years before in circumstances sudden and cruel enough to have left him permanently wary of the ways in which the world could take from him without warning. And Mrs. Vell's careful words found, in that particular wound, a foothold they would not otherwise have had. He did not confront Eleanor directly, which was perhaps the greater cruelty, for a direct confrontation might at least have given her the chance to answer. Instead, when she called next at the hall, she found the warmth of her reception subtly, unmistakably altered. Mrs. Fairholt's greeting was kind but strained. Henry was not brought down to see her at once, but kept occupied, she was told, with his lessons. And the Duke himself received her not in the small sitting room where they had grown accustomed to talking freely, but in the formal drawing room, standing rather than sitting, with a careful distance in his posture that told her, before he had said a single word, that something had shifted against her. "Miss Winslow," he said, "thank you for coming. There are some questions I find I must put to you, and I hope you will forgive their directness given the circumstances." "Of course, Your Grace," she said, though her heart had already begun to sink at his tone. He asked her, in careful, measured language that never once accused her outright, but circled the accusation closely enough that she could not mistake its shape, about the second horse, about how she had come to be standing so near it, about whether she had known, before the day of the first rescue, anything of his son's habits or his nurse's routines in the market, about whether it was true, as he had been told, that she had called at the hall with what some considered unusual frequency for a woman of her station. Eleanor felt the colour drain from her face and then rush back into it, hot with a hurt that went beyond simple embarrassment. "You believe I arranged it," she said slowly, "that I put your son in danger, that I let a horse nearly trample a child, for the sake of what might come after." "I did not say that," the Duke said, though his silence in the moments before had already said enough. "You did not need to, Your Grace." She drew herself up, and though her voice shook, she did not let it break. "I have known your son 8 weeks. I did not know his name until the moment his nurse spoke it over my shoulder, with him still shaking in my arms. I did not seek him out. I did not plan for a horse to bolt, nor for a second one to shy at a wedding bell, 3 streets from where I happened to be buying candles for my mother's supper. If you believe otherwise, if you believe I am capable of using a child's danger, any child's danger, as a ladder to climb by, then I think there is nothing further I can say that will alter your mind. And I will not stay to be questioned like a thief brought before a magistrate." She left before he could answer, walking the 3 miles home with her back very straight and her eyes burning, and did not permit herself to weep until she was safely within her own small room, with the door shut behind her. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life since her father's death some years before. The rumour, given a kind of tacit legitimacy by the fact of her sudden absence from the hall, for absence in a small town's arithmetic is so often read as confirmation, spread further, and grew crueler in the spreading. She lost 2 regular customers at her mother's stall, women who suddenly found reasons to buy their thread and ribbon elsewhere. A boy she had known since childhood crossed the street rather than pass near her. Her mother wept quietly over the mending some nights, though she never once said a word of reproach to her daughter, and Eleanor understood, with a bitterness that frightened her by its intensity, exactly how quickly a good name could be dismantled by people who had never once troubled to earn one of their own. She did not see Henry in all that time, and it was this, more than any of the rest of it, that hollowed her out most thoroughly. She thought of him often, wondered if he asked for her, if he had been told some version of the ugly story that would make him look at her differently were they ever to meet again, if the easy trust between them, built across so many small afternoons in the orchard and the nursery, had been quietly poisoned by words spoken in rooms she had never entered. It was the boy himself, in the end, who began to unravel the lie, though he did not know he was doing anything so significant. He had grown fretful and withdrawn in Eleanor's absence, refusing to say why to Mrs. Fairholt or his tutor, until one evening, pressed gently by his father, who had grown troubled himself by his son's low spirits, though he would not yet examine too closely why, Henry burst into tears and demanded to know why Miss Winslow had stopped coming, whether she was angry with him, whether he had done something wrong. "I have not done anything wrong," the Duke said, more sharply than he intended, and then seeing his son's face crumple further, gentled his voice and knelt to the boy's level. "No, Henry, you have done nothing wrong at all. It is a grown matter, and complicated, and not one you need trouble yourself over." But Henry, with the single-minded persistence of a child who has decided a thing must be understood, would not be put off, and in his pressing he said something that struck his father like a physical blow. "Is it because of the horse?" he asked. "The second one." "Because I saw it too, Papa. From the window of the chandler's, I was there with Nurse buying my licorice. And Miss Winslow didn't do anything. She only jumped because it was loud. Everyone jumped. Even Nurse jumped. And then she went quite white and had to sit down on the bench outside because her hip still hurt her from the first time, from when she saved me. I heard her tell Nurse so. She wasn't cross or clever about it at all. She was frightened, like anybody would be frightened." The Duke sat very still. "You were there," he said slowly. "You saw it." "I told you I saw it," Henry said, with the faint exasperation of a child who feels he has not been properly attended to. "I told Nurse to tell you. I'm sure I did. Only everyone was so busy being cross about something else that nobody listened to me." The Duke rose from his knee feeling, for the first time in weeks, the full and specific shape of what he had done. He had taken the word of a woman whose interest in the matter he had not troubled to examine closely enough, over the plain, unprompted testimony of his own son, freely given and never once solicited, and he had let that misjudgment stand between himself and the one person who had, without asking for anything in return, thrown herself into the path of danger for the sake of a child not her own. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning he called for Nurse and had her account of the second incident confirmed in every particular, that Eleanor had done nothing but startle, as anyone would, and had in fact been the one to go pale and unsteady afterward, leaning on the chandler's bench to recover her breath. Hardly the behavior of a woman engineering chaos for her own advantage. He called next for the chandler himself, who remembered the whole business clearly, and said much the same, adding, with the blunt honesty of a tradesman who had no stake in either side of the matter, that he'd always thought it a shabby thing, the talk that had gone round the square about Miss Winslow, and that, in his opinion, the only person who'd behaved oddly that whole season was Beatrice Cole, who'd seemed almost pleased by the trouble. It was this last remark that sent him, at last, to speak with Mrs. Vell directly, and the conversation that followed was not a comfortable one for either party. Mrs. Vell, confronted plainly with the question of where precisely she had first heard the rumor, and how thoroughly she had examined its truth before carrying it to him, found her careful language of reluctant concern rather less serviceable than it had been, and after a great deal of evasion admitted, with visible discomfort, that she had heard it from a market woman's gossip, and had not, in fact, troubled to verify a single particular of it before bringing it to his attention. "You believed the worst of her," the Duke said, quietly, "on so little evidence that I am ashamed now to think how easily I let myself believe it too." He did not raise his voice to Mrs. Vell, for it was not, in the end, entirely her doing. She had carried a story, not invented one, and the fault of believing it too readily and too completely lay finally with him, a fact he did not try to shift onto anyone else's shoulders. But it was made clear, gently and without cruelty, that her position in the household would need to be reconsidered, and Mrs. Vell, understanding the shape of what had truly been lost to her, did not argue the point. That left only the matter of Eleanor herself, which the Duke found, when he came at last to it, considerably more difficult to set right than any household arrangement. He did not send a note this time. He walked, himself, the 3 miles to the small house where Eleanor lived with her mother, arriving on foot and without ceremony in the late afternoon. And when Eleanor's mother opened the door and found the Duke of Alderbourne standing on her step, hat in hand, she was too startled to do more than call, in a strangled voice, for her daughter to come at once. Eleanor came to the door with flour still on her hands from the bread she had been kneading, and stopped short at the sight of him, her face going through several expressions in quick succession before settling into something guarded and careful. "Your Grace," she said, "this is unexpected." "I have come to apologize," he said, without preamble, "for I find I do not know a graceful way to approach it, and I would rather say it plainly and badly than delay it any further in search of eloquence I do not currently possess. I was wrong. I let fear and unexamined talk carry more weight with me than your own character deserved, and I questioned you as though you were a stranger of doubtful intent, rather than the woman who saved my son's life at the risk of her own, and I have no excuse for it beyond the poor one that I was afraid. And fear makes fools of better men than I have shown myself to be these past weeks." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, her hands still dusted with flour, her heart beating hard and uncertain in her chest. "Henry told you," she said finally, "about the second horse. That I only startled, the way anyone would." "He did," the Duke said, "though he ought not to have needed to, for I ought to have asked you myself, directly, honestly, instead of standing in my own drawing-room like a magistrate, and letting you walk out of it thinking I believed you capable of using a child's safety for my own." He stopped, seeming to hear the tangle of his own words, and began again more simply. "I am sorry, Miss Winslow, not merely for the questioning, but for the weeks after it, for what I allowed to be said and believed about you, while I did nothing to correct it, for the harm that has come to your good name and your mother's custom and your own peace of mind. All of it needless. All of it built on nothing sturdier than gossip I did not trouble to examine before letting it stand between us." She studied him for a long moment, and he let her, understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, how much he had asked of her trust and how little he had done, in recent weeks, to deserve the continuation of it. "It hurt," she said at last, quietly, "more than I think you know. Not the town's talk. I had begun to steel myself against that, for people will say what they like, and there is little to be done about it. But you. I had begun to think of you as someone who saw me clearly, and then in a moment you looked at me as though I were a stranger capable of anything, and I did not know how to bear that, on top of everything else." "I know," he said. "I have thought of little else these past days but how it must have looked to you, and I do not ask you to set it aside easily, nor to trust me again simply because I have walked here to say I am sorry. I ask only that you allow me the chance to earn it back, in whatever time that takes, for I find—" He stopped again, and this time when he continued his voice had lost some of its careful formality, roughened instead by something more honest. "I find that these past weeks without you calling at the hall have shown me plainly enough what I had been too slow to admit even to myself, that it was never only Henry's happiness I looked forward to in your visits, that the house has felt a good deal colder and quieter without you in it, in ways that have nothing to do with my son at all." Eleanor felt the flour-dusted hand at her side curl slowly into a fist, not from anger now but from the effort of holding steady against the sudden, unlooked-for warmth spreading through her chest. "You cannot simply say such things on my doorstep, Your Grace," she said, though there was no real reproach in it, only a kind of startled wonder. "I find I have grown tired of saying only the things that are safe to say," he answered. "It has cost me a great deal already this season, saying only what caution advised rather than what I knew to be true. I should like, if you will permit it, to stop making that particular mistake." She did permit it, in time, though not all at once, and not without first requiring, gently, but firmly, for she had been made to feel small and doubted once already, and did not intend to let the lesson go to waste, that whatever trust was to be rebuilt between them be built plainly, in the open, without the shelter of Mrs. Vell's careful whispers, or the town's idle talk to shape it in secret. The Duke agreed to this readily, glad of the chance to prove in daylight what he had failed to defend in the dark, and over the weeks that followed he did so with a steadiness that went some way toward mending what had been broken. He called on her mother's stall himself, publicly, on a market morning when the square was at its fullest, and stood there some quarter of an hour in full view of the town discussing thread and ribbon, with a gravity that made several onlookers exchange astonished glances, before turning to remark, in a voice pitched to carry, that he counted himself fortunate indeed that a woman of Miss Winslow's courage and good sense had been standing near his son on the day it mattered most. It was not subtle, and he had not meant it to be. He corrected, wherever he encountered it afterward, the lingering shape of the old rumour, and did so with enough quiet authority that even Beatrice Cole found her audience for such talk dwindling rapidly to nothing, until she took, within a month or two, to speaking of the whole matter as though she had never doubted Eleanor's character in the first place, a reversal that Eleanor noted with some private amusement, but did not trouble to challenge, being more interested by then in mending what lay ahead than in relitigating what lay behind. Henry, delighted beyond measure to have Eleanor restored to his afternoons, made certain that anyone within earshot of the nursery understood exactly how the second horse had truly happened, in a telling that grew, if anything, even more indignant on Eleanor's behalf with each retelling, until Mrs. Fairholt began to tease him gently that he ought to be paid a barrister's fee for the thoroughness of his advocacy. And slowly, week by week, the easy warmth that had once marked their afternoons together returned, not quite the same as before, for something had been tested now, and could not be entirely untested, but sturdier for having survived it, the way a mended bone is sometimes stronger at the break than the untouched length of it on either side. It was in early autumn, some 2 months after that difficult afternoon at her mother's door, that the second crisis came, sudden and frightening in a way that tested, one final time, everything that had been so carefully rebuilt between them. Henry fell ill with a fever that came on hard and fast in the space of a single night, the kind that frightens physicians as much as parents, for it did not respond at first to the usual remedies, and climbed steadily through the following day, until the boy lay flushed and half-conscious in his bed, murmuring things that made no sense, his small chest working hard for breath. The Duke, who had already lost one person he loved to sudden illness, was very nearly undone by it, pacing the corridor outside the sick-room in a state so close to despair that Mrs. Fairholt sent for Eleanor, without waiting to be asked, guessing rightly that her presence might steady him where nothing else could. Eleanor came at once, and did not leave the hall again for 3 days. She sat with Henry through the worst of the fever's climb, bathing his forehead, murmuring the same stories he had once told her so many times about the horse and the trough, as though the familiar shape of his own small triumph might anchor him to waking. The physician came and went, his face growing no more reassuring with each visit, and spoke in the careful, hedged language of a man unwilling to promise what he could not be certain of, which frightened the household a good deal more than plain speaking would have done. Mrs. Fairholt kept the kitchen supplied with broth and cool water through all hours, and the maids moved through the corridors on quiet feet, as households do when illness has settled over them like weather, and the Duke himself scarcely left his son's bedside, except when Eleanor, with a gentleness that brooked no real argument, sent him out to eat something or sleep an hour, promising to wake him at the least change. On the second night, when Henry's breathing grew ragged, and his small body arched against the sheets in a fit of restless heat, Eleanor held his hand through it, and spoke to him in a low, steady voice about the orchard in blossom, about the beetle he had once shown Mrs. Fairholt with such solemn pride, about all the ordinary small joys of a boyhood she meant, with everything in her, to see him live long enough to keep having, until at last the fit passed, and he sank into a heavier, quieter sleep. She sat too with the Duke, in the long hours when the physician could offer nothing but grim patience, and it was in those hours, stripped of all formality by shared fear, that whatever remained unspoken between them finally found its voice. "If he does not recover," the Duke said once, very low, in the deep of the second night, staring at his son's flushed face, "I do not know what I would do. I have already learned what it is to lose someone and go on living regardless, and I do not think I could learn it twice." "You will not have to," Eleanor said, though she could not have promised it truly, and took his hand without quite deciding to, and he held it as though it were the only solid thing left in a world gone suddenly to water. Henry's fever broke on the fourth morning, as such fevers sometimes mercifully do, breaking all at once in a night of heavy sweat that left him weak but unmistakably on the mend. His eyes clear again when he opened them, asking in a thin, cross little voice why everyone was crying when nothing was wrong. The relief that moved through the house that morning was of a kind that leaves no room for pretense, and it was in the quiet aftermath of it, in the small sitting room where they had first properly talked so many weeks before, that the Duke finally said the thing he had been circling for months without quite finding the courage to land on directly. "I have very little left to offer you that would not sound absurd, given how badly I failed you once already," he said. "I cannot offer you a season free of gossip, for I suspect some talk will follow any match so far outside what people expect of a duke. I cannot even promise you I will never again be foolish enough to let fear cloud my judgment, though I hope with all my heart to have learned better than that. But I can offer you the whole of what is left of my regard, which I think, if I am honest, has belonged to you since a good deal further back than I let myself admit, since a market square, in fact, and a torn cloak, and a courage I have not stopped thinking of since. Will you have it, Eleanor, knowing everything I have done wrong, and everything I hope, from here forward, to do better?" Eleanor, who had walked into that house many months before as a stranger with flour-dusted hands and a torn hem, and who had since been doubted and shamed and, finally, painstakingly believed again, found that she did not need to weigh the question for very long at all. "I think," she said, "my answer was decided the moment I ran toward that horse instead of away from it. I only did not know then everything it would lead to." He kissed her then, gently, in the quiet golden light of that small sitting room, with the whole slow, difficult, honest history of the past months settled finally into something steady between them. And if either of them thought of the market square in that moment, of the bolting horse and the frightened crowd, and the small boy who had, in his own unknowing way, brought them both to this, they did not say so aloud, for some gratitudes are too large and too tender to need speaking, and are simply carried instead, quietly, into whatever comes next. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was a modest affair by the standards of Alderbourne Hall, held in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, with the orchard trees just beginning to blossom outside the windows. And Henry, dressed in his best coat and taking his role with immense seriousness, walked ahead of the bride down the short aisle, scattering flower petals with a solemnity that made the whole chapel smile. Eleanor's mother wept through the entire service, from a mixture of pride and relief that needed no explaining to anyone who had watched the two of them weather the difficult season before this happier one. And when at last the Duke turned to his bride before the small gathered crowd of household and townsfolk, among them, notably, a chastened and considerably quieter Beatrice Cole, who had thought better in the end of staying away, he spoke his vows in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the little chapel, steady and certain in a way that left no doubt, to anyone listening, of exactly how thoroughly the debt of that first terrible morning in the market square had been repaid. Afterward, walking back through the orchard with his new wife's hand in his, and his son running ahead through the fallen blossom, the Duke of Alderbourne thought, not for the first time, that he had very nearly let fear cost him the best thing that had ever come into his house, and that he intended, for the whole of the long, fortunate life he now saw stretching ahead of them, never to make that particular mistake again. Eleanor, watching Henry turn cartwheels badly and joyfully in the orchard grass, thought only that the ache of those hard weeks had, in the end, been worn smooth by everything that followed, the way a scar softens with time, until it becomes simply part of the shape a person carries, proof not of what had been broken, but of what had, afterward, been so carefully and lovingly mended,